Hey, what's going on guys? This is Jake at That Fit Friend, and today I'll be reviewing the Born Primitive Savage 1. So 3 pros that I have with the Savage 1 is number 1, I think if you were a fan of older cross-training shoes from both Nike and Reebok, I think you'll resonate with the Savage 1. So this model reminds me a lot of the Nano 2.0 and the Reebok Speed TR. Both of those shoes were pretty simplistic in nature, a little bit wider, and they had this lower stack height and like denser midsoles. So I think if you're somebody that thinks a lot of the modern cross-training shoes are over-engineered, then I think you'll resonate with the Savage 1 because the shoe feels a little bit more refined and a little bit more simplistic in nature with its construction. The second pro that I have with this model is if you are looking for a cross-training shoe, specifically for lifting and CrossFit, this can be a really strong option to look into. So with this lower stack height and this dual density midsole, you get a nice little stability in this shoe. So the forefoot is designed to be a little bit more responsive and the heel is a little bit more dense. However, with the lower stack height, even the more responsive forefoot feels pretty dense. And so I think if you're somebody that likes a little bit more snappiness and a bit more ground feel with your cross-training shoes, regarding the density of that midsole, you'll resonate with this model. Also, you get this full rubber outsole that gives you a good level of tread. So overall, the shoe feels very stable under heavier lifts. In the context of CrossFit, the shoe has done a pretty good job as well. I have yet to experience any breakdown issues yet. Now, obviously, once the shoe is out longer, we have more athletes testing them, we will know more about the longevity of the shoe, but thus far, I've been purposely trying to climb ropes more in this model and do more burpees so I could see more of this abrasion resistance on the toe box and the midfoot with the rope, and thus far, it's held up pretty strong. So in those 2 verticals, I think the Born Primitive Savage 1 does deliver a good performance. The third pro to like about this model is its wider fit. So this model has that more anatomical toe box. The midfoot isn't super aggressive, so you don't have a ton of arch here. So I think if you're somebody that likes that more like flattish midfoot feel and a wider toe box, you're really gonna resonate with this model. Plus with this knit upper, it does hug the foot pretty well, and you get a bit of boot support back here with this TPU cuff. So if you're somebody that wants that wider shoe that feels very like sock-like on the foot, that hugs the foot really well, the Savage 1 I think can be a really good option for that. And it's really nice, I think, that Born Primitive built a shoe that's a bit more refined and wider in nature. I feel like a lot of us have been asking for that for quite some time now, at least over the last 2 or 3 years. But that said, let's dive into a couple of cons that I have noticed with the Savage 1. So 2 cons that I have with the Savage 1 is number 1, the tongue can be a little bit uncomfortable. Now, what I've noticed with this tongue is with this mesh material, it's pretty thin. It presses down into the top of the midfoot, and then you also get this bubbling down here at the bottom of the midfoot as well, which has been kind of an issue with some other cross-training shoes. Now, is this something that really hinders your performance? Not really, it's more of an aesthetic thing, but the tongue, that can be a little bit uncomfortable. And so what I noticed is after about like a week and a half, a week of really good sessions in the shoe, that kind of subsided and it kind of broke in more. However, I will feel that here and there. It's just way less noticeable. Now the shoes are a little bit more pliable. I've broken in that upper more, but I do think if you do have like a pretty high midfoot, you might notice this a bit more, but I think it's gonna be a little bit more variable. And if you have the Savage 1, and if you've experienced that, because I know I asked in my first impressions, let me know in the comments below when it kind of subsided for you, if it has, and like what the timeline is to expect for other folks, because mine was about a week and a half, but I want to know what other athletes have experienced with this model regarding that tongue pressing into the top of the foot. Is it so uncomfortable that it's not wearable? No. But it is one of those aesthetic things where I think if Born Primitive just put a little bit more padding on that tongue or tweaked it a little bit regarding its shape and design, I feel like it would be a non-issue. So hopefully that goes away in the next iteration. The second con that I could see some folks having with this model is that if you are somebody that wants a training shoe that has a little bit more plushness for like a hit bias or even doing some more short runs, this might not be your best option. For running, this model has been fine for sprints, 400-meter bouts, and 800-meter bouts. So basically, any form of running where you're gonna be primarily on the forefoot, with this dual density midsole, it does feel decent for those running contexts. But for longer runs, I would say pass on this shoe. So for like a mile or more, you might find them uncomfortable. Now granted, if you are somebody that does like a lower stack height and the more dense and more minimalist feeling training shoe, then I think you will enjoy them for running. But for the folks who do want a little bit more plushness with their training shoes, do note that this model is gonna feel a little bit more dense, especially in the context of running. But now let's talk about the performance of the Savage 1. To break down the performance of this shoe, I'll discuss how they perform for lifting, CrossFit, versatile training, short runs, and daily wear. In the context of lifting, I really like this shoe, and that's for 3 key reasons. Number 1, I think if you're somebody who, like myself, likes a bit more of like a minimalist training shoe feel on the foot, then I think you'll like this model. This model breaks in pretty quick. You get a good level of articulation. And so if you do want that shoe that gives you a little bit more ground feedback and gives you a little bit more of a closer to the ground feel when you're doing deadlifts, squats, leg day, whatever it might be, the Born Primitive Savage 1 has done an exceptional job. I also like the midsole. So the midsole in this shoe doesn't feel so dense for lifting that it's kind of uncomfortable, but it also has a nice level of stability. So when getting up on the toes, when doing cleans and whatnot, the shoe has felt comfortable and responsive. And then when catching weight, it feels like it's easy to ground the feet in this model, and you don't have a ton of toe spring. So it does sit a little bit flatter, similar to like something like the Drop Set Trainer 2. So if you do like that kind of construction with your sole, I think the Savage 1 will also resonate with you. The third reason why I like this model for lifting is this full rubber outsole. So thus far, this shoe has done a really good job with traction on different surfaces. So if you're lifting on wooden platforms, rubber gym floors, or even turf, this shoe should do a pretty good job at giving you a nice level of traction. Plus you also have like this kind of fascia construction. It almost reminds me of that dynamic fascia band in the Innovate model. So I would guess that Born Primitive kind of took a note of that outsole and how it performed and put it on this model with their own spin. So I do like that feature with this shoe. In the context of CrossFit, I mentioned this in my pros, but this model has done a really good job for most of the WODs that I've programmed for myself. They feel pretty versatile. I like that you have enough upper security to lock you down on different surfaces, and the durability has been pretty good. With this TPU overlay over the toe box, I have yet to see any ripping issues, and the knit feels pretty well constructed, like there's no external stitching, which I personally like. And with the midfoot construction, despite having a good amount of abrasions, because you can start to see like this is a little bit fading just in color from the rope, I haven't had any major glaring issues yet. So I think if you're somebody who's doing rope climbs here and there in your WODs whenever your gym has them programmed, I feel like this is not going to be a shoe like the Nano X2 that breaks after one workout. It should give you more longevity. So in the context of CrossFit, the Savage 1 has done a really good job. And once again, if you're somebody who likes a less engineered shoe, that's where I think this model is going to really excel in that training context. For versatile training, the shoe does a pretty good job. And now what I like about the shoe for versatile training is its flexibility and its overall low profile feel. So I like a bit more ground feel when doing plyometrics, explosive work, and multi-directional work. And I think if you're similar, you will also like this model. I think you'll get enough boot support back here to help lock down that ankle. And I didn't have any major glaring spillover issues in this shoe. So for HIIT workouts and multi-directional work and basically any kind of like athletic focused workout, this model has done a pretty good job for my overall needs. The only issue that I will have here and there is once again that tongue pressing, and that's like if I'm doing like a lot of box jumps or like some broad jumps where I'm really trying to flex and drive into that foot and ground. That is when I will notice the tongue a little bit, but again, it's just like kind of an annoyance versus like being a whole hindrance of performance. In the context of short runs, I mentioned this already as well, but the shoe I think should perform well if you're doing sprints, 400 meter bouts, 800 meter bouts. So basically any form of running that's programmed in a WOD typically, this model should be fine. So if you're a forefoot or midfoot runner too, the shoe should feel pretty comfortable. For longer runs, I would say probably pass on this model. The density might be a turnoff for you, so just keep that in mind before you invest in this shoe. And then for daily wear, the shoe has done a pretty good job as well. I have done a lot of dog walks in this model, and it hasn't broken down yet on the outsole, and the upper has a good level of breathability for what it's worth. It's not the most breathable model on the market, but it's also not overly hot because of the more simplistic engineering of the shoe. Overall though, the Savage 1 has been a pretty well-rounded trainer, and I think if you are once again a fan of more of that minimalist feel, this will be a good model for your performance needs. So when it comes to the price for the Savage 1, you can expect to pay around $130 USD. So that's not the worst price point in the world, and it's more similar to what like the older Metcons and Nanos used to cost. So I feel like we've all kind of grown accustomed to that price, to be honest. 150 is kind of steep, but we're seeing a trend towards that. So I thought it was kind of nice that this model came out and debuted at 130 versus being a little bit more expensive. Could they be more cost efficient? Sure, but I think for 130 USD, I feel like if you resonate with the shoe's simplistic construction, I think that price point is worth it for this model. All right, so now let's answer the question, who are the Born Primitive Savage 1 best for? So number one, I think if you are somebody that has been longing for once again a more minimalist and refined training shoe, so think Reebok Nano 2.0, think Innovate F-Lite 235 V3, this model will resonate with your overall needs. It's pretty simplistic, it has a low stack height, and it has a pretty flexible construction, which is awesome for my folks who don't want an over-engineered high stack height training shoe. The second context where I think the shoe is gonna work really well is that if you are somebody that has a wider forefoot and you want more toe box room, this model should work pretty well. I have an E-width foot, and this model has given me plenty of room despite the socks that I'm wearing, so I can wear thicker socks or thinner socks in the shoe, and they feel pretty secure, and I have plenty of room through the toe box. And the third context is if you are somebody that has a heavy CrossFit and lifting bias with your training on a weekly basis, this model should fit your needs really well. Now, who shouldn't invest in this shoe? Number one, I think if you are somebody who is much more casual and you want to shoe for HIIT workouts and some running pre and post workout, this might not be the best model for you. And then number two, I think if you have exceptionally narrow feet and you know that you have narrow feet and you find yourself sliding around in shoes with wider toe boxes, then you might want to consider that with this model, because this model does have a pretty spacious upper volume. So in your context for like narrow and low volume feet, I'm not convinced that this shoe will fit perfectly for your foot anatomy. So when it comes to the sizing and fit of the Born Primitive Savage 1, I think most athletes and lifters should be safe going true to size in this model. This model once again has a slightly wider construction, so I think the shoe will resonate best with medium to slightly wider feet. So if you have an E width foot, if you have a medium width foot, the shoe should work really well for your needs. Narrow feet, I do think this model will work as well. However, once again, if you have very exceptionally notably narrow feet and you know that, and you might have a more low volume midfoot, you might want to consider that with this shoe. But I think for most foot anatomies, this model will work pretty well, and the upper does feel spacious enough to give a nice wide range of foot thicknesses, a nice spacious feel in this shoe. All right, so now let's talk about the weight, heel to toe drop, and insole of the Savage 1. For the weight of this model, my model came out to about like 11.15 ounces for my size 10 shoe, and that was on the scale. I don't have my food scale on me while I'm traveling, so that might be off by a couple of ounces, but overall this shoe feels pretty lightweight. The heel to toe drop in this model is 4 millimeters, and this model does have a removable insole, and so this insole is a little bit more flexy through the forefoot and midfoot here, and it's a little bit more stiff back here in the heel, but you do get a good level of upper volume in the shoe, so if you have custom insoles, I do feel like this model could be a good option to put those in. All right, so now let's go over the construction of the Born Primitive Savage 1. Up here on the toe box, we have a wide extended outsole layer. I like that for durability. And then looking at the toe box construction, it's a little bit wider, and we have that knit upper over the forefoot into the midfoot here, and then we have a TPU layer here that biases the big toe and then fades into the lateral side. I like this for lateral stability. I thought this was a good move from Born Primitive. You also have this layer that extends into the midfoot, and then you have that mesh material that runs throughout the entirety of this shoe from the midfoot back here to the heel with some Born Primitive branding here on the lateral side. Looking at the heel itself, we do have a TPU cup back here, and that boot itself has a little bit of structure and a bit of padding back here, so I do think boot security won't be an issue for most folks, and this boot will give you a nice lockdown feel. Looking at that midsole, you once again have that like more dual density midsole. So up here in the forefoot, it's a little bit more compressive and pliable and responsive. And then back here in the heel, it's a little bit more dense. I personally like this midsole. I like the lower stack height in it, and I thought it performed pretty well regarding giving you enough responsiveness without feeling too rigid and too dense. Looking at the outsole in this model, you have a full rubber outsole, and you have like this more like fascia construction here through the midfoot into the forefoot. I like it because I feel like that does kind of help contribute, giving this shoe a little bit more flexibility. And then looking at that midfoot, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 eyelets that go up with a 6 back here for lace lock. And then you have that tongue construction. This is a thin tongue. It does have a low gusset. And then looking at this bubble once again, if you do have to tighten your shoe up, you might have this bubble down here, so definitely be warned. It's not the most aesthetically pleasing, but it doesn't really hinder performance per se. Once again, this model does have a removable insole. The forefoot and midfoot in this insole are a little bit more pliable, with the heel being a bit more dense, but that pretty much wraps up the gist of the shoe's construction. If you have additional questions, drop them down below. All right guys, that wraps up my review of the Born Primitive Savage 1. Honestly, for a first pass, I thought this shoe was pretty well rounded and a pretty strong performer, and I hope that Born Primitive stays on this more like minimalist, simplistic trend that they're building out with the Savage training shoe line. If you have additional questions on this model, drop a comment down below or reach out to me personally, whichever you prefer. And as always, y'all, drop a like in the video, subscribe to the channel. I'll see you in the next one.